Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to congratulate everyone on this very blessed occasion of the birth of our fourth Imam, Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. I'd like to recite a couple of poems with regards to Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam, manqabat, inshallah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. نام سجاد کا جب ورد زباں ہوتا ہے، نام سجاد کا جب ورد زباں ہوتا ہے، نام سجاد کا جب ورد زباں ہوتا ہے، مجھ پہ دنیا کو فرزدق کا گماں ہوتا ہے، عشق سجاد میں مطلوب ہے اعلیٰ ظرفی، عشق سجاد میں مطلوب ہے اعلیٰ ظرفی، اس کے قابل کوئی کم ظرف کہاں ہوتا ہے، اس کے قابل کوئی کم ظرف کہاں ہوتا ہے، در پہ سجاد کے آیا جو سوالی بن کر، در پہ سجاد کے آیا جو سوالی بن کر، لوٹتے وقت وہ سلطان جہاں ہوتا ہے، لوٹتے وقت وہ سلطان جہاں ہوتا ہے، خطبہ عابد بیمار کی ہیبت ہے یزید، خطبہ عابد بیمار کی ہیبت ہے یزید، جو تیرے شہر میں آغاز اذاں ہوتا ہے، تیر گردن پہ لگا بولے یہ ہنس کر اصغر، تیر گردن پہ لگا بولے یہ ہنس کر اصغر، دیکھو سجاد کا بچپن بھی جواں ہوتا ہے، خون سجاد بھی ہے خاک شفا میں شامل، خون سجاد بھی ہے خاک شفا میں شامل، ہے مصلی جہاں سجاد وہاں ہوتا ہے، طوق لعنت کا لیے پھرتا ہے اب نام یزید، طوق لعنت کا لیے پھرتا ہے اب نام یزید، بغض سجاد میں ہر سودا گراں ہوتا ہے، بغض سجاد میں ہر سودا گراں ہوتا ہے، اے حمیدہ بدی کہتی ہے نگاہ عرفان، اے حمیدہ بدی کہتی ہے نگاہ عرفان، جشن سجاد میں جنت کا سما ہوتا ہے، جشن سجاد میں جنت کا سما ہوتا ہے، نام سجاد کا جب ورد زباں ہوتا ہے، مجھ پہ دنیا کو فرض دق کا گماں ہوتا ہے، صلوات علی محمد وآل محمد، اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد عجل فرجہم۔ ایک اور منقبت چھوٹی سی امام سجاد کی شان میں، اور محمد وآل محمد صلوات اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔ مسلمانوں نہ تم اب تک علی کا مرتبہ جانے، مسلمانوں نہ تم اب تک علی کا مرتبہ جانے، جناب سید سجاد کیا ہے بس خدا جانے، قدم نہ دے علی پڑھ کر بڑھائے جا رہا ہوں میں، قدم نہ دے علی پڑھ کر بڑھائے جا رہا ہوں میں، نشان منزل کا جانے اور زہرا کی دعا جانے. مبارک زینب و کلثوم کو عابد کی آمد کا. مبارک زینب و کلثوم کو عابد کی آمد کا. محافظ آ گیا ان کا زمین کربلا جانے. مسلمانوں عبادت کا سلیقہ سیکھ لو ان سے. مسلمانوں عبادت کا سلیقہ سیکھ لو ان سے. یہ ساجد ہیں یہ عابد ہیں یہی روح دعا جانے. یہ ساجد ہیں یہ عابد ہیں یہی روح دعا جانے. مریض لا دوا آ جا علم کے سائے میں آ جا. مریض لا دوا آ جا علم کے سائے میں آ جا. یہ مرض جانے شفا جانے خاک کربلا جانے. کہ مرض جانے شفا جانے خاک کربلا جانے. مسلمانوں نہ تم اب تک علی کا مرتبہ جانے. جناب سید سجاد کیا ہے بس خدا جانے. صلوات علی محمد و آل محمد. اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد. اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد وعجل فرجہم.
اعوذ باللہ من الشیطان الرجیم. بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم. وبہ نستعین انہ خیر ناصر ومعین. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحیة والإکرام على سیدنا ومولانا ابی القاسم محمد. اللہم صل علی محمد وآل محمد. اما بعد فقد قال اللہ الحکیم فی محکم کتابہ الکریم. اعوذ باللہ من الشیطان الرجیم. الذين ينفقون في السراء والضراء والكاظمين الغيظ والعافين عن الناس والله يحب المحسنين. Dear brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to begin by first congratulating all of you and all of the mu'mineen and the followers of the Ahlul Bayt throughout the world on this auspicious day of the birth anniversary of our fourth Imam, Imam Zainul Abidin, Sayyid al-Sajjadeen, Ali ibn al-Hussein alayhim as-salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And also commemorates this series of days wherein we've been reflecting on and thinking about the teachings and the memories of the Ahlul Bayt as a whole. To begin, I would like to as well talk about the function of the Imam, trying to think about and trying to remember those teachings of our fourth Imam. It's useful to think about the function of an Imam in general. There is a hadith from our eighth Imam, Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Reza alayhi salam, where he describes this very function. What is the status of imamat? The Imam says, Al-imamu yuhillu halal Allah, wa yuharrimu haram Allah, wa yuqimu hudud Allahi, wa yadubbu an dinillah. He says, an Imam is a person who establishes and conveys and makes permissible whatever Allah has made permissible. And he prohibits whatever Allah has prohibited. The Imam Reza is explaining that the direction and the very criteria upon which an Imam establishes his teachings is that sacred and divine criteria. It's the criteria that Allah has conveyed to His creatures. وَيُقِيمُ حُدُودَ اللَّهِ. And the teachings of an Imam are not just in terms of words or in terms of his own personal deeds, but it's in the deeds of that entire society. He establishes the limits and the punishments which society is built upon. وَيَذُبُّ عَنْ دِينِ اللَّهِ. And the Imam defends the religion of God. وَيَدْعُو إِلَى سَبِيلِ رَبِّهِ بِالْحِكْمَةِ وَالْمَوْعِظَةِ الْحَسَنَةِ وَالْحُجَّةِ الْبَالِغَةِ. And he calls towards the path of his Lord through wisdom and through beautiful counsel, through good counsel. وَالْحُجَّةِ الْبَالِغَةِ. And a clear proof. I want to just take a moment here to think about and reflect on this idea of a proof. We call our Imams Hujjajullah, or an Imam is a Hujjatullah, meaning an Imam is a proof of God. When we think about what it means to prove something, when we're in an argument, for example, we're trying to convey an idea that initially seems unclear, initially seems that it is not maybe valid or true, but we're trying to prove that it is true. So for example, if I'm trying to argue with someone, I will go through certain steps, I will say certain things to prove that what I'm saying is true. If I want to prove to someone that I can accomplish a task, I need to go through certain actions to prove that I can accomplish that task. Let's take maybe somewhat of an obvious or a silly example. So let's say, hypothetically, there's someone who does not believe that it is daytime. They think that it is night. What I need to do to prove that it is day is simply by pointing them towards the outside world. I say, look outside. The sun is shining. Right? There's nothing else that I need to use to prove that point. Now, this may be sort of an obvious instance, an obvious argument. Maybe none of us have engaged in this, but it points to an important idea. And that is that, yes, sometimes to prove something, we need to use our words. Sometimes to prove something, we need to use our actions. But sometimes simply the presence of something allows us to prove that that thing exists or that thing is valuable. Indeed, the Imam functions in this way. How do we prove that piety is something that is valuable? That God fearfulness, God consciousness is something that is valuable. That is something that we must strive for and yearn for in our own lives. Now we can talk about how piety is important. We can even maybe show through our own actions that we should go through these steps and these are the results. But to be in the presence of someone who is pious, to be in the presence of someone who is totally fearful and conscious of God, that is a different story entirely. And this is really the function, one of the main functions, and one of the main means by which the Ahlul Bayt are proofs of God, is through their very presence. It's through their very existence among the Muslim Ummah. Imam Reza in this hadith continues, he says, Al-Imamu كالشمس الطالعة بنورها للعالم وهي في الأفق بحيث لا تنالها الأيدي والأبصار. The Imam is like the risen sun, which brightens and illuminates the world with its light. It is in the farthest horizon, which none can reach with their hands, nor even with their eyes. When we think about the status of an Imam is like that shining sun. He illuminates the path of a believer, of the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, and not only that, of the Muslim Ummah in its entirety. Even for those who might try to ignore the presence and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, those teachings would reach them. And the Ahlul Bayt and the Imam himself is at such a lofty and exalted status that however we might strive, they always establish and set that ultimate goal that we are trying to reach within our lives. Now, when we're thinking about how this corresponds to the life in particular of Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam, we have to think about the political and social context of the Imam. We see that after the death of Imam Hussein, the Muslim Ummah was in utter chaos. It was in shambles. See that the death of Imam Hussein begins a process of rebellion and revolution throughout the Muslim Ummah, and it continues to stay even after the Umayyad dynasty has fallen. So we see that after the Ahlul Bayt, those who have survived the massacre at Karbala, when they come back to Medina, they begin to recount the story and the tragedy that had befallen them at Karbala. And when the Medinans hear this, when the inhabitants of Medina start to realize what has happened to the Ahlul Bayt, they are repentant and they rise up against the Umayyads. Of course, at the same time, you have in Mecca as well Abdullah ibn Zubayr overthrowing and rising up against the Umayyad governor and against the Umayyads themselves. Now what happens within a year or two span of time is that the Umayyads retaliate. They send a large force against the Medinans, a force at the head of which is Muslim ibn Uqba, come and ransack the city of Medina, kill and slaughter multiple companions of the Prophet, people who were bearing the memory and the teachings of the Prophet. It said that hundreds of companions were killed during this battle. And with this massacre, we also see that the memory of the Prophet is also erased. Those teachings of the Prophet are also erased. So we see that the Muslim Ummah, what has become now an empire, stretching from the east to the west, this is falling apart, politically and socially. And we see that slowly, when in fact the mission of the Banu Umayyah was not just to gain control and to lead the Muslims politically, but was also to establish a legitimacy for themselves. Now, when we think about political legitimacy, when we think about the context, the political context during the time of Imam Zainul Abidin, we see that the Banu Umayyah are not just trying to gain a political legitimacy, but what they're trying to say is that as the Khalifa of the Prophet of God, the Khalifa himself has both political as well as religious and spiritual legitimacy over all of the Muslims. So if you want to be a proper Muslim, you have to give bay'ah to the Khalifa. If you want to be a scholar at any level of society that you want to have any sort of authority or any sort of say, you have to give bay'ah to the Khalifa. It's combining of political authority and political power with religious and spiritual power, with religious and spiritual authority. That was the ultimate aim. And what this does is that it values political power over all other things. This was the memory of the Prophet that was being disseminated throughout the Muslim Ummah. That what we take pride in as Muslims was slowly starting to become this political power. When we look back in Muslim history, we have to ask ourselves, what aspect of Islamic civilization do we take pride in? Which part of Islamic civilization do we feel a kinship and a closeness and a proximity towards? When we remember the memory, when we recount for ourselves and for our children the memory of the greatness of Islam, what aspect, what dimension of that greatness do we think about? For the Banu Umayyah, it was this vast empire that they had created. All of this wealth and all of this prestige that they had brought to their own family in particular, but as well to the governors and all of the other individuals that was a part of that establishment. And slowly we see that in this beginning, this first 100 years or so of the of Islamic history, we see that slowly the Khalifa surrounds himself with scholars. He surrounds himself with knowledge, with religious knowledge, with the memory of the Prophet. And so we see that the scholars of Islam, those who were supposed to uphold that message of the Prophet, are slowly starting to be drawn towards the Khalifa as well. In fact, some of the Khulafa themselves were, earlier in their lives, they were known to be scholars. And so they were trying to unite these two different dimensions. For example, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, who was one of the main Khulafa during the time of Imam Zainul Abidin, this person was known earlier in life. He was a resident of Medina, and he was surrounded by companions who had seen the Prophet, who had conveyed the message of the Prophet. He was known as someone who would engage with these companions, who would learn from them, who would sit at their feet, and was in fact silent in their company. There's an interesting story, a report that Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, Abdullah ibn Zubair, and Urwat ibn Zubair, these three who were from a very young age, they were friends with each other, were fellow classmates. They ask each other what is that ultimate goal in life that they want each to reach. Abdullah ibn Zubair says, I want to rule over the Haramain, Mecca and Medina. This is my own aim in life. This is my goal. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan says, I want to succeed Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, and I want to become the next ruler, not just of the Haramain, but of the entire Muslim Ummah, the entire known world. And Urwat ibn Zubayr said, I want to isolate myself and I want to go and spend my time in study and reflection. And yet we see that over time, as conditions of life change, as the Muslim community itself changes, we see that even a devoted and studious scholar like Urwat ibn Zubayr, he himself was also compelled to go and give bay'ah and to align himself with the Bani Umayyah, even though the Bani Umayyah were responsible for killing his own brother, for the downfall of their dynasty, this short-lived political power that the Zubayrids had. And there are other scholars who had to align themselves and ultimately align themselves with the Umayyad court. We see it's within this political and religious and social context that Imam Zainul Abidin fulfills his task as an Imam. We see that the Imam, slowly through his words, through his teachings, and through his very presence, is separating that religious authority and reclaiming an authority for the Prophet and the memory of the Prophet and the family of the Prophet. We see that, for example, Imam Zainul Abidin time and time again would look and speak to the people of Medina. There's a very famous report by Thabit ibn Dinar, otherwise known as Abu Hamza al-Thumali, where he says that whenever Imam Zainul Abidin would talk about zuhd, would talk about divorcing oneself from the world, all of the people who were his audience would begin to cry. The Imam would talk in such beautiful terms about responsibility towards God, about a love of God, and a lack of importance for the spectacle of this world, that those who were listening to him had no other option but to fall in tears. So Abu Hamza, he says that there is this sahifa where the Imam talks about zuhd, and he takes this sahifa to the Imam himself, and the Imam corrects it, and this is part of what it says. Imam says, كفانا الله وإياكم كيد الظالمين وبغي الحاسدين وبطش الجبارين. May God suffice and protect us, and you, from the guiles of the unjust and the oppressive, and the lust of the envious, and the assault of the imperious. أيها المؤمنون لا يفتننكم الطواغيت وأطباعهم من أهل الرغبة في هذه الدنيا. O faithful believers, O mu'mineen, don't let the insolent and their followers who aspire to this world try you and test your resolve. وَاحْذَرُوا مَا حَذَّرَكُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْهَا وَازْهَدُوا فِي مَا زَهَّدَكُمُ اللَّهُ فِيهِ مِنْهَا وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى مَا فِي هَذِهِ الدُّنْيَا رُكُونَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَهَا دَارَ قَرَارٍ وَمَنْزِلَ إِسْتِيطَانٍ. And beware of that which God has warned you of, and abstain from that which God has commanded you to abstain from. And don't incline or rely upon that which is in this world, like those who take this as an everlasting abode. And then the Imam continues, وَلَيْسَ يَعْرِفُ تَصَرُّفَ أَيَّامِهَا وَتَقَلُّبَ حَالَاتِهَا وعاقبة ضرر فتنها إلا من عصمه الله ونهج سبيل الرشد. And none know how its days pass and its condition changes, and the ultimate end of the harm that its tribulations cause. None know these things except for the person who has been protected by God and treads on the path of guidance. And then the Imam says, continue and engage in contemplation and reflection. Think about where you are and where your life is headed. Take heed through patience in those difficulties. Abstain from the spectacular glamour and glitter of this world. Withdraw from its pleasures and yearn for that everlasting blessings, those blessings of the hereafter, and tread its path. Go on that path towards the blessings of the hereafter with vigor and with vigilance. The Imam, through his words, conveys this message that was the basic and ultimate message of the Prophet that had been forgotten only 50 years or so after the Prophet's death. Only 50 years. Within this span, not only have the Ahlul Bayt been decimated, not only has Imam Hussein been killed, but with the killing of the Ahlul Bayt, all of these memories of the message of the Prophet have also been forgotten. All of those values have been undone. All of those teachings have been erased from the minds and the conscience of the Muslims. And the Imam is trying to rekindle this. He's trying to reinvigorate those memories. Remind people of what those teachings were. The Imam does this not just through his words, but through his actions. When we think about the prime teachings of Imam Zainul Abidin, we think about the du'as that have been passed on to us. This Sahifa as-Sajjadiyya, this compilation of du'as. What the Imam shows us is that du'a is not just for those who have become hopeless of all of their other efforts and all of their other means in their lives. In fact, du'a is the beginning and the end of any effort that we place in our lives. And anything that we do begins with du'a, because once we do a du'a, once we supplicate and pray to Allah, this aligns our intentions with those intentions that Allah wants us to have, and it redoubles our efforts. Once we know that, for example, I am doing this for the right reason, I'm invigorating myself, I'm giving myself that much more energy to be able to accomplish this task. And as well, we know that ultimately any other action that we do in these efforts, in this path, we're trying to as well reinvigorate and rekindle that relationship with God. So the dua is both the beginning and the end of our lives. The Imam says in his famous dua for Makarimul Akhlaq, he says, O Allah, bless Muhammad and his household. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And cause my faith to reach the most perfect faith. Make my certainty the most excellent certainty. Make my intention to the best of intentions, and my work to the best of works. So dua then is not for someone who is hopeless of all other means for reaching his wants. The dua is the very foundation upon which we begin and we establish and we erect our efforts. We establish our lives. And now let's come to the presence, the very being and the very presence of the Imam. What effect this has for the Muslims. We see that there's actually a very interesting report and a poem that has become part of the literature of Islamic history by a man, a poet by the name of Al-Farazdaq. As the story goes, Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, one of the later Khulafa of the Banu Umayyah, before he became caliph, he sets on a trip towards Mecca. He comes into Baytullah al-Haram and he is trying to get close to the Kaaba. He comes along with this company of followers and men, and he's trying to reach the Kaaba. When he gets near the Kaaba, he sees that there's this huge crowd of people surrounding the Kaaba and doing their rites, accomplishing their responsibilities and their tasks as being within the Baytullah. And as Hisham ibn Abdul Malik and his companions try to get closer to the Kaaba, they are stopped by this crowd. The crowd doesn't even budge when this prince of the Umayyads come close. Being unable to get close to the Kaaba, they stand back, they establish a throne for the prince, and he sits, and they look on the worshippers who are gathered there. And as they're gazing upon the worshippers, they see that all of a sudden this one man comes close to the Kaaba, and they see that the entire crowd parts as this person gets closer to the Kaaba. It parts to such an extent that he's able to go and touch the Hajar al-Aswad, that black stone on the Kaaba, and without any sort of trouble. And the company of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, they're in total surprise and shock. They ask each other, who is this person who is, without any sort of trouble, has come and done this? When we were trying to get close to the Kaaba, we weren't able to because the crowd wasn't even paying attention to us. But not only is the crowd paying attention to this person, but they actually part so that he can get close to the Kaaba. And as they're asking each other, Farazdaq, part of that company of men, he was a poet of the Khalifa, this poet of the court. He says, I know who this person is. Farazdaq says in his famous poem, هذا الذي تعرف البدحاء وطأته والبيت يعرفه والحل والحرم هذا ابن خير عباد الله كلهم هذا التقي النقي الطاهر العلم هذا ابن فاطمة إن كنت جاهله بجده أنبياء الله قد ختموا يغضي حياء ويغضى من مهابته فما يكلم إلا حين يبتسم الله شرفه قدما وعظمه جرى بذلك له في لوحه القلم. This person, all of Mecca recognizes his footsteps, as does the house of God and the sacred sanctuary. This here is the son of the greatest servant of God. Here is the pious, immaculate, wise servant of God. If you are ignorant of him, this is the son of Fatima. The chain of prophecy was sealed by his forefather. He lowers and shuts his eyes in humility. He is bringing to life, manifesting that humility of the Prophet when coming and facing his Lord. He lowers his eyes, he lowers his gaze when he comes towards the Kaaba. He does not come towards the Kaaba in a haughty way, thinking that he has any sort of right in the face of his Lord. He lowers his eyes in humility while all others are in awe, and they lower their gaze and are silent until the moment he smiles. God himself has exalted his steps and ennobled him. His, subhanahu wa ta'ala, divine pen has etched that nobility in the divine tablet. It is the presence and the very existence of the Ahlul Bayt that spreads the blessing and the message of the Prophet and the message of Islam throughout the Muslim Ummah. And it is through the actions and the existence and the teachings of Imam Zainul Abidin that we see within only a few years this legitimacy that the Banu Umayyah were trying to attain. This legitimacy is entirely and totally stripped away from them. And the Ahlul Bayt are able to reclaim their place within the Muslim Ummah as sources of guidance and sources of spiritual growth and sources of scholarship. It is through the actions of Imam Zainul Abidin, through the fruits of their actions, that Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq are able to teach the multitudes of Muslims that they were able to only within a few decades. In fact, if we think about the change that occurred during the beginning of Imam Zainul Abidin, where it is said that only about 3 or 4 companions of the Ahlul Bayt, followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt, were left within and amongst the Muslims, until the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, where it is said that hundreds of people would come and sit at the feet of the Imam and would recount in Kufa the ahadith of the Imam. It is through this patience, through the forbearance of Imam Zainul Abidin, through the teachings of Imam Zainul Abidin, through the du'as and his divorcing himself from the world that had forsaken at that time the Ahlul Bayt, that ultimately they come back. And ultimately the political and social and religious situation within the Muslim Ummah changes in such a way that the Imams, some level, of course things had not come to their proper place, but at some level the Ahlul Bayt were able to influence the trajectory in which the Muslims were going, to such an extent that the Khulafa of the Banu Umayyah and as well of the Banu Abbas always struggled to gain some sort of religious and spiritual authority amongst the Muslims. The Imams were able to separate scholarly and spiritual authority from political and, for example, financial authority within the Muslims. The Muslims no more saw their ultimate goal in political aims, they saw it in spiritual and religious aims. What they valued within Muslim society became not purely politics, but as well became in terms of akhlaq. And this is one of the most important, one of the benefits that we gain from the words of the Imam, is that we as well can value those makarim al-akhlaq that we learn from the dua of Imam Zainul Abidin. And we can end here by recounting that dua of the Imam, where he asks Allah for those most beautiful virtues for himself and for those around him. In the beginning of dua makarim al-akhlaq, the Imam says, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa alih, wa balligh bi imani akmal al-iman, waj'al yaqini afdal al-yaqin, وانتهي بنيتي إلى أحسن النيات وبعملي إلى أحسن الأعمال. O Allah, bless Muhammad and his household. Cause my faith to reach the most perfect faith. Make my certainty the most excellent certainty. Make my intention to the best of intentions and my works to the best of works. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.